Does sharing entrepreneurial failure stories encourage people to succeed? That's kind of the question. In recent times, it's become more common and more acceptable to talk about and share failure stories. In some cases, it's even become a badge of honor for entrepreneurs and companies to fail. I mean, there's even been failure conferences in San Francisco until recently when people just decided, hey, we don't need these conferences anymore because talking about failure is just part of the entrepreneurial process and culture that people need to go through. I mean, entrepreneurs recognize that talking about failure is actually part of the learning process and ultimately part of the success process. But sharing and celebrating success stories is really not part of the culture in most educational institutions. And I would say that SAS is really no different in that respect. If you do a cursory search on the internet for failure stories, you'll find lots and lots of stories that talk about overcoming failures and hurdles and eventually becoming successful. Most of these stories, however, are from celebrities or people who are uber wealthy or have become multiple millionaires or billionaires. These are not stories from people like you and like me. You know, if you take a look, stories like Richard Branson of Virgin, you know, he began by selling records out of the boot of his car. People like Steve Jobs starting companies with $10 out of his mother's garage. People like J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. People like Jack Ma and Alibaba. And the list goes on and on and on. Everybody seems to love these failure stories, but do you really have to be a millionaire or do you have to be a billionaire to be able to tell these stories and have anybody listen to them? I don't think so. And does listening to a millionaire or a billionaire that you don't even know, does that resonate with you? Do these stories resonate with you? Do they encourage you to succeed? You know, success stories are fantastic, but failure stories, they're really even better. So what I want to do is I would like to share with you my 15-year journey of failures with this little electric car. In the year of 2000, July 2000, I'd been in Singapore for about 4 years, and I had often wondered, why isn't there any electric vehicles in Singapore? Singapore is a very small place geographically. It doesn't have huge temperature swings. It just seemed right to be able to have an electric vehicle here in Singapore. So I started one of those late night searches, as you do on the internet, you know, prop myself up. And I started searching about electric vehicles. And I found this really interesting 3-wheel electric vehicle that registered and insured as a motorcycle. I thought, well, hey, that's kind of interesting. At the time, in Singapore, the certificate of entitlement to own a vehicle was $30,000. And I thought to myself, wow, if I could get this vehicle into Singapore and get it registered and insured as a motorcycle without having to have a motorcycle license or wear a motorcycle helmet, I thought that that would be just an absolute coup, right? A coup for Singapore. This vehicle, I just believed in the idea of this vehicle so much that I invested $50,000 into the company that was making this vehicle in California. At the time, Corbin Motors was the only company that was working to satisfy the 2003 California Air Resource Board requirement that 10% of the vehicles in California had to be zero emissions. No players in the game except for Corbin Motors. I thought, wow, that's great. So I dumped my cash into it, and I thought, you know what, this is such a perfect thing for Singapore. I'm going to buy one of these things. I'm going to buy one of these things, I'm going to organize the logistics, and I'm going to ship it here in its own shipping container. You know, I believed in it that much. It arrived in May of 2001. And I knew that getting this thing registered was not going to be easy. But I was one of those teachers like many that told kids to take a risk. And I thought, you know what, this is my time to take a risk. I'm going to take a risk and I'm going to do this thing, right? I was probably overly naive about just how difficult that this process was going to be. And I probably had to be, because if I knew then what I know now, I never would have ever got this thing to Singapore, right? So, yeah, I mean, this vehicle took me 2.5 years to get it registered. And I know that there's many people out there in the audience that are somewhat familiar with this story. 2.5 years. The first year of trying to get this thing registered was sending emails, having meetings with the decision maker people at the Land Transport Authority, trying to convince them that, hey, this thing should be registered as a motorcycle. In the meantime, I had met with members of local parliament. I had met with people in the Prime Minister's office, trying to convince these people that, hey, yeah, this is the future of Singapore. Until the big slammer came, when somebody from the Ministry of Transport came and said, look, we have made a policy decision that this cannot be registered on the roads in Singapore as a motorcycle. But they didn't say it couldn't be registered as a car. So I had to sort of take a step back and say, well, that wasn't really what I was looking for, but I've gone through this process. I'm gonna go ahead and register it as a car. So I spent the next year trying to collect paperwork on all the components that's on the inside of this car. I mean, nobody had registered a fully electric vehicle in Singapore before, and one that didn't really fit in one category or another. It was like kind of trying to put a square peg in a round hole. I mean, this is a motorcycle. There's a sticker on the inside that says it's a motorcycle. Motorcycles don't have crash test data. There's a story behind that one. Electric vehicles don't have emissions data. How am I going to provide that? It really was a challenge to be able to do it. And I kept jumping through the hoops, and I just kept jumping through the hoops, and I thought I was getting closer to that date when I could have an inspection to get this thing registered. And every time I would get close, something else would come my way. Things that seemed small, but they would take me weeks and months to be able to overcome. You know, something as simple as putting amber indicator lights on the back and trying to rewire that into the system so when you push on the brake, you don't get lots of weird lights coming on. Still doesn't work. Something that they said, oh, not a problem. The speedometer on the inside, miles per hour and kilometers, came back and said, you know what, you have to have the kilometers per hour. It took me 2.5 months to try to find an electronic speedometer that could fit on the inside of this thing. So it was a long, long journey. You know, once I got through the hoops and it was registerable, I came up with the next hurdle. Before I could get this thing on the road, I owed $62,000 in tax on this little baby. But I owned it, so I couldn't finance the tax. These are all part of vehicles that you drive here in Singapore, but you just don't pay it like that. It's against the Singapore finance rules to actually finance something that you already own. You can't finance tax. So I owned the vehicle, but I didn't have $62,000 to actually register this thing. I tried nearly everything. I had people trying to advertise on the side of it. I had a check for $30,000 in my hand from a company that was going to advertise on the side of it, which fell through. And I eventually found a company, a leasing company, that would loan me the money to be able to get this thing registered. I mean, for you young kids here in the audience, there was no such thing as GoFundMe back in 2000, right? I had to come up with this money. And so I was able to get the money through this company, this leasing company. It was just a couple days before I was getting ready to go and sign the paperwork. And I got word that the financing agent had a rollerblading accident on the East Coast Parkway with a bicycle, and this guy was in a coma. And nobody inside the company would actually pick up my paperwork or move it forward. They didn't want to move anything on the guy's desk because they didn't know if this guy was going to live or die. So my financing just went flat. I was back to square one again. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I've been at this for like 2 years. How can this be happening to me? You know? How could this be happening? I eventually got over that hurdle. I was able to get the money and get this thing registered. And I remember this thing was parked here at SAS. My first drive out the front gate at SAS. And it was like euphoria, you know? I have a video of this thing as well. And I started driving it the first week, and I was following a nice procedure to be able to break in the batteries. And I remember my first drive over 3 kilometers. I was driving over here on Woodlands Avenue 12. I thought to myself, that smells a little bit like smoke. And smoke was coming in. I opened up the door, popped the hood, and as soon as the hood came up, there were flames that were coming out of the top of this. I'm not kidding you, this high. I had no way of getting this fire out. I'm like taking off my shirt and trying to like get the fire out. It had melted 3 batteries in the front, melted the front battery compartment, and basically melted the front of my car. That was like my first drives with this thing. I was like, oh my God. So I didn't even have a telephone number to a tow truck, you know. This was a time, you know, cell phones were just becoming popular. I managed to get a tow truck to come and tow it, but have you ever tried to tow a 3-wheel vehicle before? It doesn't work, right? There's like 5 inches of clearance on the front to be able to tow this. I'm like, this can't be happening to me, right? I couldn't even tow this thing back to SAS. I managed to tow it back and get it back to SAS, and that was kind of my first experience. And it wasn't long after that I got word that Corbin Motors in the United States filed Chapter 7 and closed their doors. So my 50,000 US dollar investment was gone, poof. But in the process of trying to get this thing registered, I had to throw $20,000 more to become the authorized dealer. So 70,000 US dollars of my money was gone, just like that. And it became very, very real to me very, very quickly that there was no dealership that was behind me to help me with this vehicle. I was on my own to keep this thing on the road. I was my own maintenance man. I was my own maintenance man on a vehicle that was little more than a proof of concept vehicle with no manuals. There were reverse engineered schematics from techie people on a Yahoo discussion group in California like me that were trying to figure out, solutions to their own problems. I was on that thing every night corresponding with people trying to figure out, solutions to this thing. I had, broken belt problems. I had internal wiring problems. I had structural problems that the door wouldn't close that I had to, redo bodywork. I had brake problems. I had to upgrade the rims and the tires, but the lug nuts were imperial, not metric. So I had to take all the rotors off and put metric rotors on. I had a battery charger that was starting to fry my batteries that cost $500 a piece. There's like $6,000 worth of batteries in here. I had to get and research a new battery charger. I had to customize the bracket and find some guy to be able to fabricate it for me. I actually had to modify the front of this to look like a proboscis monkey now, just so I could get the new charger in the front of it. It was one thing after another. And these things took time and energy to try to research and get parts and find technical support online and locally and running around. I was spending late nights on the discussion group, and I was spending weekends trying to source parts all around Singapore, trying to keep this thing on the road. It was challenging. At one point, this vehicle was actually up in the maintenance garage with all the lawnmowers because that's the only place that I could work on this thing. You can't even work on it at a condominium in Singapore. As soon as you pop the hood, you're in violation. So it was just on and on and on. I always like to drive this vehicle with my windows down, and there was a couple reasons why. Number one, and people would always ask me, you got an air con? I said, yeah, I got the V290, or the V90, roll the two windows down and drive 90. That was my air conditioning, right? But I like to roll down the windows and drive with it because, in the radio, there was so much electronic interference in here, I couldn't even have a radio in here. So I would just listen, and I would listen for all the squeaks and all the bumps, and it was kind of like music, and I knew where everything was on this vehicle. And I would try to troubleshoot and fix these things later. Well, I started hearing a sound that developed, and I said, hey, that's kind of familiar. I know what that sound is. It was my rear fender that started to come loose again, And I said, okay, I'd fixed that before. I'd put a new bolt in, a rubber grommet, and tighten it up. It was midweek, and I said to myself, you know what, I'm going to wait till the weekend, and I can jack this thing up and slide underneath and get dirty and fix it right. Well, one morning I was getting off the off-ramp over here on the SLE at Woodlands Avenue 2, and many of you know this, and it was dark. And just as I was going around the corner, I heard this loud bang! And I thought, oh no! And I started sliding uncontrollably toward the guardrail, and I stopped just before I smashed it. I thought, oh, I must have broken a belt. So I jumped out, and I was trying to pull the belt out, because I was in a really bad spot. I was like on the blind spot of this exit ramp, and cars were starting to whiz by me. Well, when I jumped out, it wasn't the belt that was actually broken. It was the fender that had come loose and wrapped itself over the top of the wheel and stuck itself into the frame and the wheel. And it was like a ski. That's why my car was just skiing down the road. I had no control over it. And I was like, oh, geez, I've got to get this car out of the way because I'm in a dangerous spot. And just then, I sort of looked over, and you guys will get a chuckle. I saw the former high school principal, Mr. Norcott, sort of he was running down the road in the beam of his own headlights, saying, hey, Jim, I'll help you out. So, we ran over here. Here's Mr. Norcott and myself trying to get this car back onto the road. And then it wouldn't go forward, but it would go in reverse a little bit. But it was smoking. The tire was smoking up the fender. So Mr. Norcott jumped out, and he was stopping the traffic. Go ahead, Jim, get it out on the road. So I said, all right. And by this time, I was so hot. I was sweaty. I was frustrated. I had grease on my hands from trying to pull the belt out. I had grease on my pants. And I was pissed. I said, you know what? I'm going to drive this vehicle in reverse, if I have to, all the way back to SAS from over there on Woodlands Avenue 2. And Dave Norcott was out there stopping the drive. Go ahead, yeah, do it. And so I put it in reverse, and I was like, yeah. yeah, and this thing was smoking. And I drove it in reverse all the way down to the bus stop with smoke rolling off the back of it until it finally melted the fender. And then I could turn around and drive it forward like this all the way to SAS. And when I got to school, I was hot and sweaty and greasy and just tired, just tired. 10 years of owning this vehicle, I had many, many successful stories, but I had many, many embarrassing failure, frustrating, expensive sort of stories as well. And I glossed over even some of them. But, I want to sort of end by saying that, when people share failure stories with people that they know and they respect, it really does create a sense of connection and community. I mean, if you can believe that. And really, having a tight-knit community and a connected community are some of the ingredients that people need to be able to try and to succeed. And I know some of you are saying, well, if sharing failure stories is so great, why don't more people share failure stories? And this is something I really learned putting this TED Talk together, is that I think there's three primary reasons. There is shame, there's fear, and there's vulnerability, right? Those three things. Initially when I imported this vehicle to Singapore, I wasn't afraid of failing, hey, no big deal. But the more I spent on this vehicle, the more money that went into it, I started becoming more afraid of failing. And the more and more money that went into it, I started to develop a sense of financial shame, really. How could I have spent so much money on this ridiculously odd-shaped orange one-seater electric vehicle? How? How did it get to this point? It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be, right? It wasn't so fun. And the other thing that I would like is for everybody to sort of walk away with three things, moving forward. And the first thing that I would recommend for all the young people, and even the older people in the crowd, is to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, I'm not saying to be weak, because vulnerability doesn't mean weak. The second thing that I would encourage everybody to do is to share your failure stories with your friends. Share it with your teachers, share it with your mentors, and share it with your parents, all right? And the third thing that I would encourage people to do is try something where you have absolutely no guarantees of success. Try it, try it. Just as vulnerability is kind of the core of fear and shame, vulnerability can also be the birthplace of joy, creativity, belonging, and love, really. So you have to ask yourself, does telling failure stories encourage people to succeed? That's not really for me to answer. It's for you to answer. Thanks for listening.